Welcome to the tutorial creating a custom particle effect. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you obviously how to start from scratch to build your own particle effect system. And then I had also mentioned that I was going to show you how some of the remaining modules that exist in the particle effect tab, how they work. However, I realize there's still quite a few to go over, and a lot of them are quite repetitive. So I might only go through a couple instead of going through all the remaining. So the first particle effect system I'd like to show you how to create is one using the image fracture. So let's just look for our basic building blocks to start. So we know for sure that we need a baker and that we need a system composite, we need a visualizer, and as I mentioned before, we also need the image fracture, which is right here. So they're all kind of bunched up, so let me just spread them out a little bit. So we know that the baker always goes into the visualizer. We know this because of the color. The visualizer will go into the scene composite. The particle system composite, which will composite all the action modules, which are these purple ones, goes into the baker, and then we'll start with our image fracture like that. So the first thing we need is a sprite for our image fracture. So the image fracture is unique in that it actually needs two sprites. It needs an image and it needs a matte. So let's add a drawing layer to our timeline stack, and then I'm actually going to create just a simple circle. I'll use the ellipse tool, and I'm actually going to get rid of that grid. There we go. And so I'll use the ellipse tool. I'll hold down Shift and Alt to create it from the center. And then what I'm going to do is fill this with color. So let's go into the particle effects palette for our scene. And I'm going to create a new swatch. And let's make it a gradient just for fun. Something like that, and let's name this rainbow. Oops. Okay, so we have our swatch, and I'm going to fill our circle with color, and actually I'm just going to get rid of this black border because we don't really need it. So now let's go to the drawing view, and actually we need another drawing layer, but before I create another drawing layer for our matte, I'm going to name this one Rainbow Circle. And then we're going to create another drawing layer, and I'm going to name this one Matte. And I'm going to turn on the light table so I can see my rainbow circle. And what I'm going to do is draw a bunch of black jagged lines across this circle in the way that you would see a shattered mirror if all the pieces were glued back together. And it doesn't matter if you use the pencil or the brush tool. And then I'm going to select the ellipse tool again to create another black outline like this. Which might be a bit nicer visually to see. So I'm going to select everything on this layer, and I'm going to flatten it. And then I'm going to use the cutter tool to get rid of any of the rough edges. I'm not even really sure how necessary a lot of this is. You can kind of decide for yourself how neat you want your mat to look. In retrospect, I probably should have used the polyline tool to create this. I'm just so used to using the pencil or the brush tool. So I might speed up this part of the video, just this cleanup section. And then I use the contour editor to fix up a bit of these rounded lines so that they're all really, really straight. You can also use the smoothing tool. It's another way of getting rid of these extra points. I'm just going to make sure that all the joints overlap properly as well. You have to zoom in pretty close to see that. So here we have this extra little piece. So that's perfect. We know that it's actually overlapping properly. Here as well. So I think that looks pretty good. And this is what our mat looks like. You can also have mats of solid colors. So say, for example, you had big solid black circles. The part of this rainbow circle then that would be cut out when we added it to the image fracture would just be these cut out circles from this big circle. So you can have various types of mats and you can experiment that to see how that works. So now let's go to the network view again. And our mats are currently connected to our scene composite, but we want them to be connected to our image fracture. So let's unplug these and move them up here towards the image fracture. So the image goes into the right port and the mat goes into the left port, like that. And then if we go to the camera view, we still don't see anything, and I think I know why that is. If we select the image fracture module, we can see that its trigger in its layer properties in the generation tab is set to 0. So unlike every other action module in the particle effects tab that are automatically set to 1, which means they're automatically enabled, this one is set to 0. So let's change that to 1. And now we can at least see our rainbow circle in the camera view. But then if we drag the playhead across, we see that it's not fracturing. But in fact, it actually is. It's just that it's fracturing in the wrong direction. And so if we go to the perspective view, I'll show you what I mean. So already we can see that clearly some type of fracturing is going on, but because of the perspective we happen to see the circle in the camera view, so it's almost like this fully frontal, we don't see any of these parts being broken. And actually, as I drag the playhead across, you'll see that they're also not spreading out from any type of central source. So we know already that even though the image fracture can break apart an image, it clearly cannot move them. And these are where some of the other action modules are going to come into play. I don't think I'm going to go through all the layer properties of the image fracture because we've seen them all before in the sprite emitter. I think the sprite emitter has even more. So if you want to know about any of the properties that belong in the image fracture, you can check out the sprite emitter and all those questions will be answered for you. So let's add some initial velocity to start and see if that doesn't get us moving. So we'll go back to the module library. We'll scroll down until we find velocity. We'll add it to our network view. I'm going to plug that in. Already we see something happening here. Okay, so we see it moving to the right in the camera view, and in the perspective view, okay, it's also moving right. So if we open up the layer properties for the velocity, we'll see that's because the X is the only one that has any influence. It's set to 1. So let's change that to 0. And let's change the Z to 1 so that these pieces will come towards us, or come towards the camera. The other thing we'd like to change in here is the velocity type. Right now it's set to constant speed, but what we really want to see is either random in all directions, 2D or 3D. I'll start with 2D so you can see what that looks like. Breaks apart like this. So it breaks apart outwards, but if you look at it in the perspective view, let's back out a bit here, it's still breaking along the same plane. So it's breaking outwards along the same plane. If we change that to 3D, however, and we drag this across, we'll see that it breaks out in all different planes. So X, Y, and Z, it's breaking out. And the effects look pretty similar though in the camera view. Well, these ones get smaller as they're receding in space, etc. Like that. So that's a pretty easy one to create on your own. You can always continue to add things. You can add a sync so that once you've gone past a certain level, these particles don't disappear forever. Also, tweaking is a big deal. I mean, it's easy to create this, but it looks like it's going a little bit slowly, so you might want to change the speed. You know what I mean? Like, it's all about tweaking it to make it look exactly as you would like, using all the different layer properties. But let's move on and try to create another particle system. So for now, what I'll do is I will group this system. So I'm going to select all the modules in the network view and then use Command G, or I believe it's Control G on Linux or Windows, to make my group. And just so I don't forget what it is, I'll say Rainbow Fracture, and that's the name of our group. And once again, you can also do all sorts of things like add a peg here on the outside, and then as this is fracturing, it can move from right to left, or backwards and forwards, or up and down. You can add gravity so that the fracture falls completely, towards the ground. You can add all sorts of things to continue on this basic structure. But one of the next effects I'd like to build with you is creating a vortex. So there's the orbit and the vortex, which are kind of similar, and I just decided to do a vortex instead. So I'm going to drop that in there, but once again, we have to drop in all our basic building blocks, that being the visualizer, the region composite, and the baker just to start. Oh, not the region composite, sorry. I meant the system composite, so I'll put that in. So it's a good thing those things are color-coded. Made me realize my error right away. So the vortex is actually one of those effects that doesn't create particles on its own, but creates the motion of the particles. It creates an action. So we actually do need a sprite emitter as well, just to begin. Okay, so let me plug this into the composite. Let's hook up our system so far as we think it should look. And of course, what we need, let me disable this, is a sprite once again. So I'm going to create a vortex of many, many little particles. So I need to create another drawing layer. And I'm going to go to the drawing view, turn off that light table, turn on the grid, and I'm just going to draw little circles in the center of this grid. I might zoom in a little bit. I'll use the brush tool. So let's look at our color palette again, and I'm going to create a bunch of colors, I think, as well. So let's add some brighter colors. So let's add that. Okay, actually, I think that's good. So we have, along with the red, 5 other colors. So I'm just going to scroll across and continue to use these colors to draw little circles. Okay, so we have 5 particle types in our drawing layer, and let's name this colored circles so we know what it is. And then go back to our network view, and once again it's plugged into our composite, but what we want to do is plug it into our sprite emitter. And then if we go to the camera view, okay, we don't see anything yet, and that's because I think we have to fill in the information for our sprite. So number of particles, I think I'm only going to start with something like 10, and 100% chance that these are going to be produced per every frame. Sequentially assigned type number, yes. So particle type 0 is on frame 1, particle type 1 is on frame 5. Right now, let's say age at birth is 0, which means it'll start slowly building 10 particles, then 20, then 30, then 40, etc. Particle mass, we can keep it that way for now. And then for the rendering, we're going to use the particle type. We don't really need to cycle it. You can cycle usually when there's no movement coming from the action modules, but that the actual action is coming from an animated sprite. That's generally when you want to start cycling. So we can leave it at no cycle for now. And I'm pretty sure all the other default values are okay. So what I really think we're looking for now is a region from which the particles will be emitted from. So let's go back into the module library and look for a 3D region to plug into our sprite emitter. And there we go. In our camera view, we're finally starting to see some particles. But if we scroll across, we see once again that they are not moving. So what's happening here are that the particles are just starting to fill up the region in which they're being generated from. So in this case, it's this sphere. But they're not moving upwards or in any direction. So before we start adding anything like maybe initial velocity or move particles, there are a few other things we can try to make some movement in our particle system. Let's go back into the sprite emitter. And I think you saw me hesitate when I was in the generation tab to change the mass of the particles, because right now this mass is quite high, and the higher this mass is, the harder it is for these particles to float upwards. So let me just change this to something quite a bit smaller. And then I'm going to close this. And now if we scrub across again, I think you'll see, yes, so you'll see that already these particles are really starting to spiral in a very natural fashion, so this is quite nice. So I think the one thing that we're a little concerned about, though, is this big globule mass of particles stemming from the origin source. So let's go then back to our 3D region. And it is often a lot of this back and forth. You change one thing, then you have to change something else. So let's change our maximum radius to something quite a bit smaller. If I went to view controls to bring up our actual spherical region, I think we would see it be something about this size. So let's try something like 2. And there we go. Already our origin point is quite a bit more condensed. So that's quite nice. And then we can even play with the actual shape of the vortex, which we haven't looked into yet. So if we go in here, we can see that in fact it's actually moving in the right direction, which is nice. It's this Y direction. So we can increase the value to actually increase the height of this cone. So say if I change it to something like 20. So now it's completely going off screen. We could also increase the radius of the mouth of the cone, say to something like 16. And so right now we're really just seeing the bottom, and it's going to spiral out like that, which is quite nice. So just so we can see things a little bit better, I'm going to add a peg to the particle visualizer and move the whole thing down. So let's go back to our module library. Let's go to the favorites tab, find a peg, attach it to the particle visualizer, and then let's show the translate tools controls in the camera view, and then move the whole thing down. And now we can see it spiral upwards. And of course now there's the issue of it creating particles forever. So maybe what we'd like to add next is a sink. And you might be wondering, how is it possible for these particles to be spiraling forever in movement when we have no actions that create movement? And I think I mentioned this in one of the first tutorials, that both the move particle module as well as the Baker module control movement. So if we look into the Baker module for just a second, we can see that move position is checked off. So if we were then to add a move particle module, I would uncheck this move position, and that's why we're able to still see movement even though no actual movement action module exists in our particle system composite. So we were looking for a sink, so let's go back to the particle effects tab. And we're going to go down until we find the sink here and drop that in. And we already know that the sink needs a 3D region, so let's drop one of those in as well. We're going to attach the sink to the end of our particle system composite, and I'll attach this 3D region to that. And let's take a look at what our 3D region looks like. Right now it's a sphere. I'm guessing we probably want a cylinder. And to see it, you can use the keyboard shortcuts, Command F11, or I believe it might be just F11 on Linux or Windows. So this is why we aren't seeing anything. Logically, the region gets put around the sprite emitter's region of generation. However, in this case, we would like to move this upwards. So now we actually need another peg for our 3D region. So let's go back and find one of those, attach that peg, and now let's move our 3D region upwards. And let's actually increase the height of this region, as well as its width. Okay, so that's quite big. More like it, and I think we need to make it long enough to see the generation of these particles, or it might not work. There we go. Oh, and unfortunately I made the mistake of having the animate button on, so these have been keyframed. So let me delete these keyframes and do this one more time. And take the animate button off to move this whole thing upwards. And I also have a keyframe here, I'm not sure what that's for. So now that the animate button is off, let's bring this back in to view. And now we can see our wonderful vortex spiral, but disappear after it leaves the sink. And if we hide our sink region, we can see what that looks like. So it's quite nice. And you can actually add a peg to the vortex to tilt it so that you get a kind of a different spiral happening. Obviously, with the peg that we attach to the particle visualizer, not only were we able to move the entire system down, but we could add keyframes and move it across. So it's like a tornado. It can even move in 3D space, so it could zip backwards a bit and come forwards and zigzag along a path, really looking like a spiraling tornado. So there's all sorts of things you can do now that you have the basic structure of the vortex. So there's only one more thing I'd like to show you, and it goes back to the rain effect that I showed you in one of the previous tutorials, and how to have two placements of the same particle system in the same scene. So once again, let's just group this new system that we created so it doesn't get in the way. I'm going to name this Rainbow Tornado. And we're going to disable this and put this over here. So let's actually re-enable the rain, if you remember it, and go inside. And there's all sorts of craziness going on here. So we have a setup that isn't correct, which is two planar regions with two pegs that are hooked into a region composite and then hooked into the emitter. So let's get rid of, I'm actually going to take a look at it from the top view and try to decide which one to get rid of. So I have to view the regions. Okay, so let's get rid of this one in the back. So I'll delete this as well as its peg, which means we also don't need this composite. There we go. Let me see if I can select all here and restructure a bit to make things a bit more clear. Well, that didn't really make things more clear, but let's try to move things around so that they're a bit easier to look at. Okay, so there we go. So I was going to explain to you how to actually go about making two systems coming from two regions. And I explained to you before that you actually need two visualizers and two particle bakers. So let's go into our module library as usual. And let's go to our particle effects tab and let's pull out a baker and another visualizer. So let me see if this will work. And then if we go back to the top, yep, there's a second plug for the composite. So let's go back into our group. So right now it appears as if there's still only a single system, and that's because both systems are producing the raindrops exactly at the same time, which means that they overlap with one another. So what we need to do is add a bit of variation. Let's then open up our particle baker, and let's add a different seed or a seed number so that these raindrops aren't produced exactly the same for both systems. So I'll just add a seed of 1 for now and see if that makes a big difference. I'm not really sure that it does. So let me just disable these for a minute. So that's what it normally looks like. And then let's re-enable these. Okay, so there is a second system and it's up here. Okay, and it's over here. And okay, so I see what's going on. So because of that seed, they're slightly staggered now. One starts later than the other, which is exactly what we want, and they are actually staggered in space. I think it's just because I'm showing the region. Oh, and now we can see. And that's because this particle visualizer already has a peg attached to it, and it moved the entire region with that peg. So we don't actually need to put a peg in this one to stagger them. And we see that there is a space in between. And if we go to the perspective view and we move around, we can see that there's this hollow space that exists between these two systems. So now for the final test, let's add a drawing object in between these two systems. Let's go back out. And once again, if these weren't grouped, and I can ungroup it if you want, you would basically just put them between these two visualizer plugs in the main composite for your scene. So instead of there being a multi-port out, these would be plugged directly into the main composite. So let's add another drawing layer, and let's grab the playhead and bring it back to frame 1. Then let's select the rectangle tool. I'm just going to check out the tool properties for this rectangle. That should be fine. Let me just undo that and do this in the drawing view. Let me just see which color I've selected. Okay, so I want black, I think. So let's create a rectangle. Let's fill it with something solid but not too intense. Maybe it'll show well in yellow. Actually, let me just make this a bit less intense. Okay, here we go. All right, and we have to extend the exposure. Okay, and right now it's in the middle of one rain. I have a feeling I know why this isn't working. Let me just first of all bring this object back in space. Here we go. Oh, actually now it looks like it's working. So I think it looks like there's raindrops passing both in front and behind, but we can do a test as well. Let me reset the view here in the camera view so we can view that a little bit larger. Let's go back to the network view. My only concern, okay, first of all, this drawing should be between these two cables on the main composite. That's the first thing. Secondly, if we go back into the rain group, we'll see that there's a peg connected to the left port of the first particle visualizer. And what this peg is doing is that it's actually moving this entire system back in space, so back along the z-axis. So that's how we know that this particle system is the one that's located back here. However, it's recommended that if you'd like to move your flattened system between or behind objects, so other drawing objects, in space, so along the z-axis, you should actually attach a peg into the right-hand port of the particle visualizer. The peg that's plugged into the left-hand port can move the entire system, including the z. However, what we're really looking to do is add a peg to this port right now. And just to double check, let's do a quick test by enabling and disabling the two systems. So right now, visually in the top view, it looks like they're staggered. It looks like this rectangle should be between them. If we look in the perspective view, it's the same thing. It sits between these two rain systems. However, if we disable the first group, we'll see there's still raindrops in front, even though they look like they're behind in the top view. So let's enable that. And then if we disable the particles, this particle baker and this visualizer, there's still raindrops in front. So either way, there are raindrops in front, but we definitely want some raindrops behind. So I'm going to re-enable this, and then I'm going to get another peg from our module library. I'm going to attach it to the system. I'm going to go to the layer properties. So you could do it here through the positioning by moving the z-axis and using B for back, or actually let's do it through the top view using the translate tool. I can move to the first frame, but it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to add any keyframes. The animate button is off. And let's move this group even further back. So now we can see that in the camera view, these raindrops have popped behind. And we can see as we cascade down, this second system here that we added, which is actually in the front, we can't see it here in the top view yet or in the camera view because remember it's staggered. If we go to the side view, we can see it's just starting now. It's just starting to enter our field of view. It's raining in, and now we see it in front of the rectangle. And if you don't believe me, we can also do our test again. We can take the front layer, disable it. It disappears. We see only rain behind. We can re-enable that. And now if we take this entire system and we disable it, we can only see rain in front. And now you can see it also in the side view. So that's it for the tutorial, creating a custom particle effect. And it's also the last tutorial in the Harmony Particle Effects video tutorial series.